This morning I have a little different time where I wanted to prepare for you this. We typically, as you well know, we will actually, if we go to the website here, we'll typically, as we go to Wednesday mornings, we work our way through and we see we're in a sequence. And we've been, as you know, for quite a while now, alternating between the Old and the New Testaments. And 2 weeks ago, we did Joshua 2, and today we would normally do Joshua 3. But in this instance, though, I felt prompted to share two things with you. And one has to do with the content of a retreat that we're going to be doing. And it's going to be this retreat at the Cove. And we're going to be actually using the entire facility, the Billy Graham Training Center at the Cove. And so if you join me here with this for just a minute here, I'm going to just find that for you here. It's going to be in May, so let's just find that for you. So if you go under events, and then you can find it here. Here's the Reflections Ministries Spring Retreat. This is for both men and for women. It's not just couples. It could be singles. It can be couples. This is for men and women. And this is going to be held on May 14 to 16 at the Cove in Asheville. And if you haven't been there, it's a very wonderful experience to even just going through the gates. There's something that happens. There's a place that's sanctified, set apart for God's purposes. And it's a very rich experience on multiple levels. And we decided then to go ahead and actually rent the entire facility. So I'd really love to have you join us and encourage your friends as well to join us at this spring retreat. And I thought the way I would do that would be to give you just a hint or a little overview of the content that we're going to be using. And we're going to be sending more things out about this as we come up. But the real thing I'd love for you to do is not only come, but to also invite friends that you have to join you as well. And so what I really plan to do then is to zoom through this content, living with wisdom in a world that has lost it. So I just thought it would be helpful just for me to walk you through just some of these thoughts about this whole theme of the 7 components of this material that we're going to be doing together, and describing something that I think is very, very needed in our time, now more than ever. There's a fundamental loss of multiple aspects of wisdom, common sense, of using our reason and appealing to evidence, and having a basis for wisdom, which is always going to be based upon the transcendent. The eternal perspective is the fundamental theme that relates to wisdom. But before I did that, I thought it would be appropriate, because of the loss of my friend Larry Crabb yesterday, that I wanted to share with you a few thoughts that I had about that and about the whole idea of living with hope as well, in times of grief, in times of loss. And so I just thought it would be interesting for me, first of all, to just read some text messages. Larry didn't do email, and he really never got into the computers and all that, but he had a great system, and he had his staff who would assist him with processes and so forth. But he and I began to correspond back in, I believe it was 2017. And this concerned my second meeting with him. I met him with Dan Allender back in Birmingham, I think, many years ago when they were still together, and it was extraordinary time. I went to a conference, and I still don't remember the details of how it happened, but it was I had a dinner with Larry and with Dan that lasted for 4 hours, just the three of us. And I still remember that conversation, and it was very rich for us. And we shared that, and it was a kind of a little bit of a hint of home, a hint of heaven, just the wonderful give and take, the repartee at table fellowship, which has always been a fundamental theme in Scripture, the whole idea of table fellowship, which becomes even the basis for the whole idea of the early church and the Eucharistic meals that they would have together, what they'd call the love feasts, where they would gather together. And the actual meal itself would be like a Eucharist for them. And so they would gather together, and they would meet in homes. As you know, there were no buildings until really the 4th century, because it was a religion that was being persecuted various times, from Nero to Decius and Diocletian and so forth. And so they were not buildings. They had to meet. It was not a religion. It was a religio illicita. It was an illicit religion, because they were regarded by the Romans as atheists because they didn't believe in the other gods. And therefore, because of that, they only believed in one God. And I think, by the way, there's a parallel between that and our own time that I think is going to be becoming much more evident, where we're going to be really, in many ways, forced to move down on the scale and go back to more of almost like an underground, kind of a subversive movement that is actually an agency of the kingdom of God, because we serve another king. And so it's an intriguing concept, and we're always going to be countercultural, but now, of course, more than ever. So we talked about a wide array of topics going back to that time many years ago. And then in 2017, I had my second, and it would turn out to be the only other meeting I'd have with him personally. And we talked about, I'm just going to be reading some of my text messages here. And so we set up a meeting for that time when I was in Charlotte, because I had found out that he had moved from Colorado to Charlotte to be closer to his grandchildren. And so in doing so, we had a rich time at that time. And what we would do sometimes as well is we would endorse each other's books. And in fact, see, he was talking about this whole idea here. We were talking about trying to get together and so forth. I'm just trying to think. So he just sent a message here. I just asked Kep to forward a book endorsement request for you and so forth. And he says, looking forward to endorsing your new work and so forth. And then we talked about that. And we went through that process. And that was very, very good. And we went back and forth again. And we were just having trouble trying to connect again. And he was... at one point, we would try to meet, and so one thing didn't work. He says, I wish it didn't play so hard to get. I'll be in Denver that entire week. Thanks for staying in touch. And then later on, disappointed again. And it was kind of a funny thing. He said, is God protecting you from me? I'm in daily chemo for leukemia. This is back now this is April of 2019. I'm in daily chemo for leukemia this week. And the next 2, diagnosed with in late September, chemo ever since, doing well, total remission, but need chemo through May to ensure it won't come back. So unavailable, regrets, hope you're doing well. Thanks for trying again. And so I spoke of how I said, I'm sorry to hear about these difficulties, but please be assured of my prayers and of my gratitude for you. And I won't give up. So I kept on pursuing to see if it would work out. And one thing after another. And then he was going to be doing an endorsement for another book, but it wasn't working out for us to have time together and so forth. And so at the end of the day, he was going to be doing my Shaped by Suffering book, but it just didn't work out for him to be able to do that, because the last message I got from him was in February, of 2020. Shaped by Suffering, great title, an important book. So sorry I didn't let you know I received it. Ken, I'm dealing with liver cancer. The leukemia I had is gone, most grateful, but gastrinoma remains. A CAT scan coming up in a few weeks will tell what's next. I'm doing all I can to cut back my schedule, mostly a focus and energy thing. I think it best to decline your request. In other words, he was not going to be able to do that endorsement after all. Old age is having its effect as well. I sincerely regret I feel I must say no to several opportunities I'd otherwise be glad to accept. May your new book strengthen many. So this is the last message I sent to him. And I said, Larry, so good to hear from you. And I affirm the wisdom of your saying no to unnecessary drains on your attention and energy. It seems likely that we will not meet again in our earthbound sojourn. But we know that we are no longer defined by the pain of our bounded past, but by the joy of our unbounded future. And as you know, that's a theme in my teachings in the last year or so, especially, that really reminds me of that. So here's how I ended it: anticipating our times together in our Father's house. And so that was, so when I think about this whole idea of how do we reflect on the loss of a loved one, and though I did not know him well, when I read about his homecoming, I was moved with grief for my loss and joy for his gain. And that is the way we need to see it when we look at these things together. In fact, there is a theme that we use a lot. This on the website, Biblical Hope in Times of Loss. And you can find this, just go to kenboa.org, and you'd find it just by, in fact, I'll just show you how it's done just to make it easy for you. So anyone can do it. So I just have loss, and that should be enough to get me there. Just typing it up here. And if I added hope and loss, it would make it work for sure. But I already found it in the first page anyhow. So there you have it, right down there, and there you have it. So any of you then can summon this up at will by doing that. And then there is a video, as you can see, as it goes with it. But and it just reviews this material here, and that's the material. And then there's another one right after that actually is more than a video. This one actually has the very verses that I use. So whenever I hear of a person who has suffered a loss of a loved one, I like to send an email to them, and that email looks like this. It's this little clumsy looking, but it looks the way it pasted in. But I said, I hope the verses below in this outline of a sermon by Jonathan Edwards provides biblical perspective and comfort. And this outline is these 3 points here. Our bad things will turn out for good, Romans 8:28. Second, our good things can never be taken away from us, Psalm 4:6-7. And third, the best things are yet to come, 1 Corinthians 2:9. Now those 3 insights, I think, can really contextualize the fact that in Christ you are more than a conqueror, and that nothing can separate us from the love of God. And then what I do is I have a link and then these verses. It'd be better to see it, though, in this other manner here. So if I go back to this text here, go back to here. So here, in Biblical Hope in Times of Loss. So what I do is I have a series, you see, of these verses. And it's just one after another. And I strongly urge you to consider sending this array of verses, or this link perhaps, if someone that you know is going through grief and the suffering of the loss of a loved one. Because the scriptures give us hope. If a man dies, will he live again? All the days of my hard service, I will wait for my renewal to come, because that's the most fundamental question. If he dies, will he live again? And if he does, it has all the implications in the world. And then it just goes through these scriptures, you see, in this manner, just in biblical sequence. And as you just work your way through this, I would have lost heart unless I had believed I'd see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. I'll hope in the Lord and be of good courage. He will strengthen my heart. Yes, I'll hope in the Lord. And so that I have a hope in God, in Acts, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. And so I strive to keep my conscience blameless. And then Paul's word, I rejoice my tribulations, knowing that tribulation brings about perseverance, and perseverance character. Eye has not seen, nor ear has not heard, nor have entered the heart of man the things that God has prepared for those who love him. And then it's just, you just work your way through these. And as I go through these, I find them to be a kind of a balm to my soul. And it gives me a perspective. And so they're good for you to go through at any time. I see dimly as in a mirror, but then I shall see face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And then other texts as well. One of my favorites, as many of you would know, is 2 Corinthians 4:16-18, and other texts of this nature, especially 1 Thessalonians 4:13-17. We should not be ignorant about those who fall asleep or grieve like the rest of men who have no hope. And this is the beauty here. We grieve, and there's nothing wrong with grief. It's appropriate and biblical that we grieve because we're suffering loss, and our grief is really not for them if they knew Jesus. It's for our loss. But there is a terrible thing that's wrong. This is not the way things were meant to be, and we know that. But we wait for and are being prepared for the new heavens and new earth in which there will be no more death, no more dying or sickness, nor sorrow. But the old things will be passed away, and the new things will come. And in fact, that's one of the texts that we have coming up here as well. So this concept then, then we even have certain poems here that you can, and these are powerful and beautiful poems as well. So I'd recommend you're doing that. I'd also recommend another one as well, and that is this Windows of Heaven video. And you just type in Windows, and you'll get this. And if I played this for just a second, let me just see how it's a beautiful summary of the very verses we just read. But in this case, though, it's music that's compiled that by Bach. It's Komm, süßer Tod, Come, Sweet Death, and it's played by Virgil Fox. That's a pretty powerful video, and I would encourage you to view that and share that link with anyone who would want to view that, because it's a time for us to reflect together upon these truths. These are real truths, and it gives us real hope. And indeed, I'm planning to play that at the celebration of my own sister's life, who passed away only about 2 weeks ago. And as a consequence, then we're going to be doing a celebration of her life and her birthday that's coming up in August. But these are powerful truths that really actually give us a sense of God's purposes for our lives and really embed us in truth and reality, not in the shadowlands of this world. So it's just a thought that I wanted to share with you. And in addition to that, this other thing I wished to do with you would be to focus on this whole theme of what we're going to be doing at the Cove Retreat. But this is a brief overview, and I hope it will be helpful just for a few minutes to just think through this wisdom series outline. And I've fleshed that out and embellished it with a single sentence descriptor of what we're planning to do in the various sessions when we meet at the Cove in May. And so first component then is an introduction to wisdom. What is wisdom then? And how do we attain this gem of wisdom? How do we acquire? And the scriptures invite us to see and to pursue and to grasp the dynamics of wisdom that are found so beautifully in the Hebrew Bible. And if we go to, for example, Proverbs, and we think specifically one of the best known texts is Proverbs 3:5-7. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. He speaks, and this is a connection, a very strong connection, an interconnect between wisdom and the fear of the Lord. This whole idea of what is wisdom. And one way of describing wisdom, it is the ability, by the grace of God, to do the right thing at the right time, in the right amount, for the right reason, and the right power. So there are subtleties, nuances of when is a word most aptly spoken? When is it best to restrain our speech? And this is really what the overview of Proverbs is about as well, because there are life-transforming principles from Proverbs that give us wisdom on this whole realm of speech and of how to listen, because we're very terrible listeners. And it turns out that effective listening is really a product in part of other-centeredness. And most people are so focused on their own agendas. So there are dynamics about how do we actually relate to the fundamental facets of life, about our work, and how do we approach work? How do we approach leisure? How do we approach our neighbor? How do we use our time? How do we use our wealth? And even deep details about avoiding speculative kinds of deals, or going surety for your neighbor, and a number of mistakes that people have made and continue to make that are really profound wisdom insights that emphasize the theme of not just live and learn, which we will do. We go through the school of hard knocks as it's described. And the whole idea is we discover, at least I have, that I've learned a great deal more through my setbacks and failures than I have through any successes I may have had. And so it's a school of training if we're receptive to the insights we gain. But there's not just live and learn. There's also learn and live. And that's where the Proverbs invite us then to trust in the Lord entirely, exclusively, and extensively with all our heart, not leaning on our own understanding, but instead certain principles of how can we learn from others so that we don't make all the same mistakes. It'd be wise to gain insight that's hard learned by others and seek to inculcate that. And that's a major theme in Proverbs, of course, is this whole theme of intergenerational communication and transmission of wisdom, which is being largely lost in our time. And so the sages are not being esteemed as they once were. And in fact, there's a disconnect that no longer prevails in the cultures in which we find ourselves. And as a consequence, then, there is a loss, a diminishment of common sense, of reason, and of wisdom. But we discover, though, that the whole idea of wisdom, as we look at Proverbs, it's clear, evident, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning, the foundation of wisdom. And so the fear of the Lord, it is a reverential awe. It is an aspect of understanding of who God is and how great he is. To recognize then that we don't know anything and that we must be absolutely dependent upon him who gives us life and being in all things. So the fear of God then is a sense of a holy awe and a realization that we can't even understand the fringes of his ways in this material world. And we are called as a consequence to understand that we could never begin to understand his ways in the deeper realms. If I spoke to you of earthly things and you did not understand, and you can't understand a molecule of water, you cannot understand a blade of grass, you cannot understand anything that you can look at on the microcosm, the midicosm, and the macrocosm. We are immersed in mystery. If I spoke to you of earthly things and you can't understand, how would it be if I spoke to you of spiritual things? And the whole point of the book of Job then really is learning the secret of obeying the one we cannot understand. So the concept then is that we are invited then to trust him and obey him, even though there are so many things that we cannot understand. I was very struck by a recent teaching of the book of Job at the fact that God's questions to Job when he appears to Job in the whirlwind and ends the debate that was going on before. It's significant that not one of the questions, often estimated at about 77 questions that God asked Job, not one of them relates to the suffering, the point, you'd think, of the book. And so Job is forced to realize that the answer to his suffering is not going to be something he can construe, contain, or understand. If God had given him an answer, then he would have said, okay, but what does that mean? What about this? And it would have gone ad infinitum. He'll never grasp the fringe. So God says effectively, you are out of control. I'm the only one in control. You cannot grasp these things, but you can trust in me. And I am the one who is the lover of your soul. I'll pursue you. And I'm the one who gives you a relationship with me. So if the thing we're called to do then is never to understand him, but instead to love him enough to trust him, to believe that he's got our best interests at heart. So the key to obedience then, which is an expression of trust, is really is trust itself, and the key to trusting is loving him, and the key to loving him is knowing him. I don't mean just intellectually, but personally, experientially, and relationally. As we look at this then, it brings us into another theme, which is the wisdom psalms. And one of the themes there is the wisdom of treating things according to their true value. And the wisdom psalms invite us to see the temporal versus the eternal perspective. It always invites us then to see that the wisest thing you can do is to treat things according to their true value. And we know that the things are in this world, the possessions, the positions, the power, the prestige, the popularity, the people, and all these other things that we hold on to, none of these things are big enough to define us. But instead, they point beyond themselves to a greater need that we have. And so we must treat things according to their true value. The earth and its works are going to be destroyed, but ultimately, God is preparing for us a kingdom that cannot be shaken. And so we do well then to build a spiritual portfolio that where our treasure is in heaven, because the heart always makes room for what it treasures. And then we see in the Ecclesiastes the wisdom of that book, which gives us in many ways an overview of the kind of contemporary thought that people have of a skepticism, for example, where people would question about the goodness of God, his power and sovereignty and so forth. And it would really be a cynical thing. It's all happened before. And so the Koheleth, the preacher, says, vanity of vanities, haval havalim, all is vanity, it's emptiness, it's evanescent, it's like a soap bubble. And this whole concept then is to realize that no, we realize that we are in this world. This world is brief, but we are being prepared for another. But the interesting thing in Ecclesiastes, he gives the best arguments you can give from a skeptical or cynical perspective to show that life under the sun, really, at the end of the day, really, you can't do much with it. And that the best you can do is what I call tempered hedonism, maximize your pleasure and minimize your pain. But at the end of the day, there's got to be more than that. And Ecclesiastes then has this interesting turn where you have an understanding of God's ways that prevails in the end. Then there's also the wisdom of the New Testament. And we'll be talking about here selections from the Gospels and epistles and the theme of the temporal and the eternal. And again, it's often been said that Jesus spoke more about money than any other topic. But actually, my view is that money he uses as an illustration of the treasuring of the temporal as such and the eternal as such. And so it's not money as such, but it's the temporal versus the eternal, which is the fundamental theme, again, in wisdom. And you see this also in the book of James. So the New Testament amplifies and adds to our understanding in the Old Testament. And then finally, living a life of truth, goodness, and beauty. You and I have been created and redeemed to glorify God as living incarnations of his wisdom. How can we live in this world, a world of uncertainty, of peril, and so forth, and it's continuing to move away from any kind of understanding of the biblical vision and moving us into a kind of false postmodernity that actually elevates the autonomous self as being the being and end of all truth, which leads to total chaos and absurdity and a loss of reason, a loss of understanding. So here we find ourselves in a world in which we're contextualized by the folly, the foolishness of living as if there is no God. And the concept then is to realize you and I are called to be agents of grace. We're countercultural. Again, I call us subversive agents in the sense that we are going against the agenda of the world. And we're inviting the world to see something far more profound. And we, through our love for one another, and through the quality of our character in our lives, are called to live in such a way that it demands an explanation. And that, I think, is really kingdom living in many ways. That we are called to live the life of the age to come, even in this present age. And that kind of living, then, is possible to the degree to which we actually trust in the Father, we abide in the Son, and we walk by the Spirit. And so it's an ongoing practice of his presence that we can cultivate and develop through habituation, through training, whereby we expose ourselves to the scriptures, renew our minds, that we begin to see and think and hear his thoughts, rather than just imposing our thoughts in scripture. We're in fact allowing the scriptures to actually elevate our thoughts to higher thoughts than we would have on our own. And so we're being shaped by the word. And I'm a very big believer of informational reading of scripture and asking it good questions, exegesis and so forth. But what we also need is formational reading, where we allow the scriptures to shape us, to point to us, for the Holy Spirit who inspired the word, who also dwells within us, to instruct and encourage, enlighten, to convict, and to illuminate the word, so that we become people of the word, whose lives are radically different because we are actually have an appetite for the things to come. And I think that's what wisdom is, and having an appetite for the things of to come, to glorify God as living incarnations of his wisdom. So those are just some thoughts that relate then to this whole concept of wisdom and what we're planning to do, as I said before, on this Cove retreat. So that's something I would encourage you to consider and being a part of. So I'm going to open it up then to some questions and open it up to Q&A and see if you have any questions about specific amplification. Again, I go to May here, and the retreat will be on May 14 through 16. And I encourage you during this time to come away with me, as Jesus said to his disciples, come away with me to a quiet place, and let us learn together about the ways of God. And so we want to come with him to this quiet place, to a special place, a special time. And by sanctifying space and time, we also mutually encourage, equip, and empower one another to be agents of grace in this dark world. So we can go ahead and open it up if you wish to questions.
And I'm sure you're also willing to take questions that don't necessarily relate to what you taught this morning.
Oh, yeah.
Would that be correct?
That's correct. It didn't have to relate to something I just said. I just felt, though, impressed that it would be good for us to think together about this whole theme of wisdom. And while I'm using that as a kind of an announcement of something that I really want us to participate in together, I think it's really a word for our time, because how do we train ourselves in this world of chaos, and it's ramping up more and more quickly? How do we train ourselves? How do we accustom ourselves to living in the milieu of heaven on earth? That is to say, we are, as I say so often, amphibious beings, 1 foot in heaven, 1 on the earth. How do we live then with hope and expectation? And this is, I think, a way we can encourage and stimulate one another to love and good deeds. So, but I'm open to whatever questions you might have.
Dan?
Yes.
This is Bunky.
Hey, Bunky.
Last time, and forgive me for going back to this, but last time we spoke about the neuroplasticity again.
Yes.
In relationship to training.
Mm-hmm.
How that could work. And after that, I had this thought or question or wonder, is it possible that God created a physiological process to support the spiritual process? That would really be a wonder.
Yes, that would be a wonder. And I think that wonder exists. I'm trying to find my little thing on the training process here.
Yeah, that thought just kind of overtook me and stayed with me all week.
That's all. Really? That's interesting. And I think you are into something, Bunky, because I think that's the case. I'm trying to remember where I put my little thing again, because I had a little idea of the training and versus trying concept here, and just see if I can find my chart. Otherwise, if I can't, I'll just do it another way. But I think there is indeed, Bunky, to answer your question while I'm looking for this, a physiological foundation or basis for this that is quite astonishing. I discussed that a little bit in my book on the practicing God's presence, so life in the presence of God, and we discussed some of this process of neuroplasticity there. I'm just trying to find my little guy here as to where I put my little chart here, because if you continue to train here and you keep on doing a thing again and again, here's what I was looking for here. So let me find it here. This is what I was looking for. You'll see if you go on a pathway here, and suppose this is a large meadow, and you are going to go from one point and then track and go across. Say this is a stand of trees in the distance, and then you walk straight back on the same way. And if you did it one time, there'd be no meaningful evidence that you'd done so. 10 times, a little bit of something. 100 times, though, if you do the same path, the same place, you begin to build a certain pattern or pathway, you see, it becomes physical. But then if you've done it 1,000 times again, because it's not practice makes perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. And so what you're doing is training and habituating. It's not trying, but it is training. And so to your insight, to your point, it turns out that there really is a physiological basis because neurons that fire together wire together. And given that notion, it turns out that there are myelin sheaths that actually get thicker and make the neurotransmitters more efficient so that you begin to build kind of neural highways along this line. This is the whole genius behind muscle memory. And we remember, you learned a new skill and how hard it was at first, whether you learned to drive in a clutch car or whatever. But at first it seemed difficult, but after a while it becomes second nature. And that's what training is involved. It becomes so habituated, it becomes part of your being, your dynamic. And I think it's related, Bunky, to this very same concept we just talked about here, where if you continue to repeat that practice, after a while, then you become spring-loaded. Now you'll see, though, of course, that I'm now seeing this is more than a field. This is who you are in the heavenly places. And this is who you are on earth, and you are a spiritual being. So if every time then, if you practice, so suppose that I begin to do some experiments where I'm doing two things simultaneously. So this is where this works well. So if I, as a spiritual being, am actually remembering to trust the Father, abide in the Son, walk by the Spirit, or if I'm praying for someone while I'm with them, or when I bring God to bear on any routine and mundane activity, because there's no reason we cannot. The more we do that, the more we become inclined to actually bring the spiritual to bear on the material, and so you begin to become habituated, and the training then creates these neurological pathways that actually make you more spring-loaded to walking in the Spirit, and less spring-loaded to walking in the flesh, until after a while becomes almost your customary way. So real righteousness then is a habituated, a long obedience in the same direction, where it begins to shape you. It becomes part of your being, part of your nature, part of your dynamic. And I think so your insight is correct. I think that God is, and we've not known this until quite recently, that there really is a physiological basis for this concept. And it's a marvel and a wonder. This is only pretty recent of knowledge that these things are actually occurring. But it does make good sense, doesn't it? Because the best thing a person can do, and this is where Dallas Willard brought up the idea of the spiritual disciplines, because I spoke of them as training, because what you're dealing with the disciplines then is you're becoming more and more spring-loaded toward this by habituation. So it becomes part of your being, part of your nature. And so by intention then, you practice these things, and you then have a skill. So it's indirect preparedness, as he calls it, which means that the time spent off the playing field in practice will then give you options that you need at the point of action on the field. The time you practice off the concert stage will then empower you to do what you need to do when you're on the concert stage. So that indirect preparedness. So the disciplines you engage in then are then going to be carried with you, so that they become more and more habituated, more embedded in your very being. Is that consistent with your thoughts on that?
Yes, and it seems to me that there's a warning contained in that also.
Yes.
That you not practice the wrong thing.
That's correct. Don't practice
or whatever.
That's correct. There's a warning, because if you see, the reality is you will be doing something. You're going to be exchanging your life in for something. And if you exchange your life or practice something, the presence of evil, or if you expose yourself to something that's unworthy of you, it too begins to have, by its own nature, a slight degree of habituation. Consider it this way, that it can first of all have a beach hold, and then it can become a stronghold if you continue bit by bit to allow the next thing to creep A creeping disobedience makes the next one possible. So it goes from a beach hold that you gave it a place to a stronghold, and then it's a stranglehold, if you want to come with that idea, where you're defined by that falsehood. So nothing's neutral, is it? Every choice, every word, every action actually contributes to us moving either closer or further away.
Ken, Phil Smith, building on what you're saying in
Yes.
relationship to your theme for the conference at the Cove,
Yes.
what I see over and over again is the way that the world uses that same neuroplasticity process to influence and develop a mindset, a pattern of behavior that attunes us to living in a culture without wisdom. Video games desensitize kids to violence. There's just advertising, and the images that get exposed in that model shape our minds in ways that we don't realize initially, but there's a subtle shaping process.
That's a good word, Phil, and I appreciate that, because there's a virtuous cycle and there's a vicious cycle. Each thing makes the next one possible, and so it's an interesting way of exploring this or looking at this. But I'm really glad that you brought that up, because you see, there's no neutral action. Each one, it will either reinforce righteousness or will subtly reinforce wickedness, and it can be something very subtle. I have a scale here like this, you see, and I've used this to illustrate this on multiple occasions. But if I were to look at this scale here, and let's consider, for example, that a person, here's the neutrality here. When you hear of a person and you hear of somebody and he wakes up and he's been caught, whatever happens, he was practicing a life of growing deception, trying to live two lives. You ask yourself, how did a man of God presumably become a -8 or whatever you want to call it? And the answer is never by starting here, but it's a slow decline. He became a -8 because he became a -7. And then how did he get it to a 7? Because he became a 6. So it's a slow declension. And so by the same principle, then, as you can see, the opposite is also true. You don't suddenly wake up and you're a +7 over here, as in the faith. You only become a 7 if you've done, by the grace of God, been faithful in the process of obedience and response. And may I say this right away, that this is an insight that has become very meaningful to me. And I know we're close to being out of time, but it's this mean insight that obedience, I'm now convinced, is the pathway to presence. Let me say that again. Obedience is the pathway to the apprehension of the presence of God. If you want to know him, if you want to know what he's like, you want to experience him, obey him and trust him, and stop asking your questions. Instead, start obeying. You'll never understand the fringe of his ways, but you're called to trust him enough to obey him. So here's the point then, this long obedience then. And so you grow up, you move up incrementally, you can go down incrementally. So everything, word, thought, deed, does matter. Take it seriously. As many of you know, I often say that most men have sloppy thought lives. They have flabby wills, and they have anemic intentions. They allow mediocrity to dominate rather than the spirit. And so that's a terrible blunder that we make when this occurs, you see. So to me, this is a critical theme that we want to see, that God has a purpose and a point for us, a way of living and being. And that to me is the life of wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And it's the flip side of the love of God, because tell me what a person fears, I'll tell you what he loves. Tell me what they love most, I'll tell you what he fears. So
that concept of shaping is drawn from the behavioral psychology very connected with that article I had sent you a couple of weeks ago.
Yes.
And I think what we want to look at perspective-wise is who is writing the behavior plan that shapes our lives. Are we submitting ourselves to a behavior plan developed by God, or are we submitting ourselves to a behavior plan developed by the world, authored by Satan?
Yes. A choice is made. You can't be neutral.